Margaret Bennett stepped down from the stagecoach at exactly 2 o'clock on a bright afternoon in late September of 1878. After 8 long days traveling from St. Louis, Missouri, to Red Pine Hollow in the Montana Territory, her boots touched dry earth she had never seen before. Beside her sat 2 worn trunks, a small carpet bag, and a future she believed had already been planned. She walked the narrow trail leading toward the mountain cabin exactly as the last letter had described. Every sentence of that letter had lived in her thoughts through the long journey west. Nathan Briggs had written that he would be waiting on the porch when she arrived. He had promised to greet her himself. He had written that everything would be ready for the beginning of a new life. The cabin stood exactly where he had said it would. The smoke rose gently from the chimney. The front door was closed. Nathan Briggs was nowhere to be seen. Margaret climbed the wooden steps and knocked once. No answer came. She waited. Then she knocked again. The door slowly opened. Standing before her was a tall young boy, no older than 15, holding a sleepy little girl in his arms. His face carried the tired look of someone who had stopped expecting easy days a long time ago. Behind him stood 6 more children. 8 pairs of young eyes quietly studied the woman on the porch. Nobody smiled. Nobody spoke. Margaret counted once. Then she counted again. 8 children. The boy finally broke the silence. "You must be Miss Bennett." "Yes." "My pa isn't home." Margaret looked past him into the cabin. The room was crowded with little boots beside the door, patched blankets folded on chairs, and toys made from carved pieces of wood. Everything was clean enough to show someone was trying, but worn enough to tell how difficult every day had become. She looked back at the boy. "When will your father return?" He lowered his eyes. "Maybe 3 weeks." The wind rolled down from the mountains, carrying the cold smell of pine trees and early autumn. Margaret stood on that porch holding her carpet bag, while 8 children waited for an answer they were too afraid to ask. She had crossed half the country to meet one man. Instead, she had found 8 children standing alone. The oldest boy shifted the little girl on his arm. "You can come inside if you want." She gave a small nod. "I think I should." The children quietly stepped aside. Margaret entered the cabin. The youngest little boy walked straight toward her without any fear at all. He could not have been older than 4. He looked up at her with wide blue eyes. "Are you gonna stay?" The older boy quickly spoke. "Jacob." The little boy ignored him. "Are you gonna be our new mama?" No one corrected him again. Margaret smiled softly but did not answer. She was not sure she knew the answer herself. She removed her traveling coat and carefully placed it over a chair. The cabin held the strange silence of a home, where children had learned not to expect grown-ups to stay very long. Margaret looked toward the oldest boy. "What is your name?" "Ethan." "How old are you?" 15. "You've been taking care of everyone." He nodded once. "We all help." She noticed the tired circles beneath his eyes. Nobody 15 should have looked that exhausted. Margaret looked around the kitchen. "When did everyone eat?" Ethan hesitated. "This morning." "What did you have?" He looked embarrassed. "Cornmeal." "Only cornmeal." He nodded. Margaret quietly opened one cupboard. Then another. She found flour, salt, a small crock of bacon grease, a sack of dried beans, Enough. She rolled up the sleeves of her dress. Ethan watched carefully. What are you doing? I'm making supper. You don't have to. I know. The answer surprised him. She mixed the dough with calm hands that had spent years baking bread, sewing dresses, and caring for younger brothers after her own mother became too sick to work. The little boy named Jacob leaned against her skirt and stayed there as if he had already decided she belonged. Margaret worked around him without asking him to move. One by one, the other children drifted closer. The smallest girl carried her a wooden spoon. Another brought water from the bucket without being asked. No one spoke much. They simply watched. Sometimes kindness looked so unusual that children forgot how to respond to it. Months earlier, back in Missouri, Margaret Bennett had placed a small notice in a marriage newspaper. She was 29 years old. Her parents had both passed away. The boarding house where she rented a room had become quieter every year. She wanted more than endless days of sewing other people's happiness into wedding dresses she would never wear herself. She received 5 letters. 4 sounded almost identical. Each promised comfort. Each promised success. Each sounded as though it had been written only to convince someone to come west. Nathan's letter had been different. He had described the land with careful honesty. 180 acres beneath Cedar Ridge. A sturdy cabin. Good horses. Hard winters. Long workdays. He had written about his oldest 2 children. He had written that they still missed their mother every day. He had not mentioned the other 6. Margaret had noticed that. Still, something about his words felt real. He never claimed life was easy. He simply wrote, "It is honest work, and honest work builds honest families." She had read that sentence again and again before deciding to leave Missouri forever. Now she stood inside his cabin, surrounded by 8 children who had been waiting for someone. Just not like this. As the biscuits baked, warm smells slowly filled the room. One by one, the children gathered around the table. No one reached for food before everyone had a place. Margaret noticed that. Someone had taught them good manners before life became difficult. She liked that. During supper, she quietly learned every name. Ethan was 15. Rachel was 13. Daniel was 11. Grace was 10. Samuel was 8. Lily was 7. Emma was 5. Jacob was 4. Every child carried sadness differently. Rachel spoke very little but watched everything. Daniel tried making the younger ones laugh. Grace folded every blanket exactly the same way. Samuel kept checking the window. Lily stayed close to her sisters. Emma barely let go of Jacob's hand. Jacob smiled whenever Margaret looked his way. After the meal, Ethan gathered the dishes. Margaret gently stopped him. "I'll wash." "You've already cooked." "I know." "You've traveled 8 days." "I know that too." He looked confused. "Then why?" She smiled. "Because everyone deserves one peaceful evening." For the first time since opening the front door, Ethan's guarded expression softened. "Only a little." But Margaret noticed. Later that night, after the younger children had fallen asleep beneath handmade quilts, Ethan found Margaret standing outside beneath a sky crowded with stars. He remained quiet for several moments. Then he asked the question that had clearly been waiting inside him since afternoon. "You're leaving when Pa gets home, aren't you?" Margaret looked toward the dark mountains where Nathan was somewhere beyond the forests she had crossed to reach this lonely valley. She thought about turning around. She thought about returning east. She thought about the warm boarding house, the sewing shop, the familiar streets. Then she thought about 8 children eating hot biscuits like it had been a holiday. She looked back at Ethan. "I don't know what your father and I will decide." Ethan lowered his head. "I figured. But I do know one thing." He looked up. "I'm not leaving tomorrow." For the first time in many months, the boy allowed himself to breathe a little easier. Inside the quiet cabin, 8 children slept peacefully, unaware that the woman who had arrived expecting a husband had already made the first decision that would change every one of their lives. The next morning, Margaret Bennett was awake before the sun reached the tops of the pine trees. The cabin was still quiet except for the crackling fire and the gentle breathing of sleeping children. She tied her apron, added another log to the stove, and began mixing biscuit dough before anyone else had opened their eyes. When Ethan walked into the kitchen, he stopped in the doorway. He had expected another silent morning with cornmeal porridge and hurried chores. Instead, warm bread filled the cabin with a smell that reminded him of years before his mother had become sick. "You've been up long?" he asked. "Long enough," Margaret answered with a smile. He looked at the table already set for 9 people. "You don't have to keep doing this." "I know. You keep saying that." "Because it's true." He gave a quiet nod. "You still do it anyway." "Yes." The younger children slowly wandered into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Jacob smiled the moment he saw Margaret. "I knew you'd still be here." Margaret smiled back. "I said I wasn't leaving today." Jacob climbed into his chair as though that settled everything. Over the next several days, Margaret learned that every child carried a burden no one else could see. Rachel had become another mother long before she was old enough to be a child herself. She quietly braided her sister's hair every morning and never complained. Daniel pretended every chore was a game because making people laugh was easier than admitting he missed his mother. Grace worried constantly that someone would leave and never come back. Samuel checked the barn 3 or 4 times each day because he feared the horses might disappear the way everything else seemed to. Lily collected smooth stones from the creek whenever she felt sad. She kept them in a small wooden box beneath her bed. Emma woke crying almost every night. Only Jacob still believed everything would somehow turn out fine. Margaret paid attention. She believed people always revealed what they needed if someone cared enough to notice. She never forced the children to talk. She simply listened whenever they chose to speak. Within the first week, the cabin felt different. Not because it had changed, because the people inside it had. She organized the pantry. She repaired torn curtains. She mended shirts that had been patched too many times to count. She planted late vegetables beside the cabin, hoping the first frost would wait long enough for them to grow. Most importantly, she brought order where everyone had grown used to surviving one day at a time. Ethan noticed first. One evening, he watched his younger brothers arguing over a blanket. Before he could step in, Margaret simply folded another quilt from an old trunk and handed it to them. The argument ended before it began. "You always know what to do," Ethan said quietly. Margaret looked at him. "No. You do. I just watch carefully." He thought about that answer for a long time. A few days later, she walked into the barn and found Ethan trying to repair a broken wagon wheel by himself. The heavy timber slipped. Before he could catch it, Margaret grabbed the opposite side. The wheel settled safely onto its stand. "You shouldn't be lifting this alone," she said. "There isn't anyone else." "There is now." He looked surprised. "You know how to fix wagons." "My father owned one." Together they finished the repair before sunset. It was the first time Ethan had shared work with another grown-up since his mother died. He realized something strange. The work felt lighter. Not because there was less of it. Because he was no longer carrying all of it himself. That evening, Margaret finally asked the question she had been holding for days. "Tell me about your father." Ethan stared into the fire. "He's a good man." "I never doubted that. He works harder than anybody." "I believe that too." "But..." Ethan sighed. "He doesn't know how tired he is." Margaret waited. "He thinks if he works harder, everything gets better." "And does it?" Ethan slowly shook his head. "Sometimes working harder just means you're gone longer." Margaret understood more from that single sentence than Ethan realized. The following morning, a supply rider stopped outside the cabin with mail and provisions. Margaret recognized the leather satchel immediately. She hurried outside. "Anything for Nathan Briggs?" The rider smiled. "I've got something for the cabin." He handed her a folded letter. The handwriting matched the letters she had carried across the country. She opened it carefully. Nathan explained the mountain trail had been blocked after an early rockslide. Several teams were trapped at the logging camp. No one could leave safely until the trail was cleared. He apologized for missing her arrival. He apologized again for not sending word sooner. Near the bottom of the page, he wrote something that made Margaret stop reading for a moment. "I hope you chose to stay long enough for me to explain. Nothing more. No promises. No excuses. Just hope." She folded the letter and slipped it into her apron pocket. That afternoon, she sat beneath the large cottonwood tree beside the cabin and wrote her own reply. She thanked him for the letter. She told him every child was healthy. She described each one carefully. Rachel worried too much. Daniel laughed even when he was frightened. Grace loved reading. Samuel had become brave with the horses. Lily sang while gathering eggs. Emma finally slept through one whole night. Jacob followed her everywhere. She also wrote about Ethan. She told Nathan that his oldest son had become a man too soon. She ended the letter with only one sentence about herself. "I am still here." The supply rider tucked the letter safely into his satchel and rode toward the mountains. Margaret watched until he disappeared among the trees. The second week passed more quickly. One afternoon, Emma developed a fever. The little girl lay quietly beneath blankets, too weak to speak. The younger children became frightened. They remembered their mother growing sick. Margaret stayed beside Emma's bed through the entire night. She cooled her forehead with damp cloths. She whispered gentle stories. She made willow bark tea the way her grandmother had taught her years before. Near sunrise, Emma finally opened her eyes. "I'm hungry." Margaret laughed softly. I've never been happier to hear those words. When breakfast came, Ethan noticed dark circles beneath Margaret's eyes. You never slept. Emma needed me. You could have woken me. You needed sleep too. He looked down at his plate. No one had protected him from worry in a very long time. That simple kindness stayed with him all day. By the middle of the third week, the children no longer hesitated around Margaret. Jacob called her Mama every single day. Emma copied him. Soon Lily did too. Rachel never said the word aloud, but she smiled whenever the younger ones did. Only Ethan remained careful. Not because he doubted Margaret, because he was afraid of believing she might stay. Late one evening, he found her sitting on the porch watching the mountains turn purple beneath the setting sun. He quietly sat beside her. After several minutes, he spoke. I used to think nobody could ever make this place feel like home again. Margaret looked toward the cabin, where laughter drifted through the open window. What do you think now? He smiled for the first time since she had arrived. I think maybe home isn't a place. She waited. It's whoever keeps coming back. Margaret looked at the cabin. The children were laughing over something Daniel had said. The sound filled the evening air. Somewhere beyond those mountains, Nathan Briggs was riding home without knowing that his lonely cabin had already become something warmer than he had left behind. He believed he was returning to rescue a household that had barely survived without him. He had no idea he was about to find 8 children smiling again, an oldest son no longer carrying every burden alone, and a woman who had arrived expecting only a husband but had quietly become the steady heart of the family before ever meeting the mountain man himself. On a cool afternoon near the end of October, nearly 3 weeks after Margaret Bennett had arrived in Red Pine Hollow, the sound of horse hooves echoed through the valley. Jacob was the first to hear them. He dropped the small wooden wagon he had been pulling across the yard and ran toward the gate. "Pa!" Every child rushed outside. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch. A tall mountain man rode slowly into the yard on a chestnut horse covered with dust from the long trail. His broad shoulders were bent with exhaustion, and his beard had grown thicker than the photographs she had imagined while reading his letters. Nathan Briggs looked first at his children. Every one of them looked healthy. Their clothes were clean. Their faces carried smiles he had not seen for many months. Then he looked toward the porch. Margaret stood quietly with folded hands. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. Nathan climbed down from his horse. "I am Nathan Briggs." Margaret nodded gently. "I know. I should have been here." "Yes. I've been trying to get home every day." "I believe you." Nathan looked around the yard again. The firewood had been stacked neatly. The garden had been weeded. Fresh laundry hung behind the cabin. Even the broken fence beside the chicken coop had been repaired. His eyes slowly returned to Margaret. "You did all this?" She smiled. "We all did." Jacob wrapped both arms around Nathan's leg. "Pa, she makes the best biscuits." Daniel laughed. "And she fixed the wagon." Lily added, "She sings while she cooks." Emma spoke next. "She stays beside us when we're sick." Rachel quietly smiled without saying anything. Then Ethan finally stepped forward. His father looked at him carefully. For the first time in 2 years, the heavy weight in Ethan's eyes seemed lighter. Nathan noticed immediately. "What changed?" he asked. Ethan looked toward Margaret before answering. "We're not doing everything alone anymore." Nathan lowered his head. He understood more from that single sentence than from anything else he had heard. That evening after supper, the younger children fell asleep quickly. Only Ethan remained outside, finishing the last evening chores. Nathan and Margaret sat together on the porch beneath a sky full of bright stars. For a while they simply listened to the wind moving through the tall pines. Finally Nathan spoke. "I owe you an apology." Margaret looked at him. "I know. I should have written when the trail closed." "Yes. I should have told you there were 8 children." "Yes. I thought if you knew the truth, I would never come." Nathan slowly nodded. "I was afraid." Margaret remained quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "You weren't afraid for yourself." He looked surprised. "You were afraid for them." Nathan looked toward the cabin window, where small shadows moved beneath warm lamplight. "There wasn't anyone else." "I know. I didn't know what to do." "You kept trying." He gave a tired smile. "It wasn't enough." Margaret shook her head. "It brought you back." Nathan looked at her with honest regret. "You had every reason to leave." "I did. But you stayed." "I did." "Why?" Margaret looked toward the sleeping cabin before answering. "The first afternoon I arrived, Jacob held my hand like he'd known me forever." She smiled. Rachel tried to hide how worried she was. Daniel laughed even when he was scared. Lily watched everyone before thinking about herself. Emma cried in her sleep. Samuel checked the horses because he thought everything he loved might disappear. Grace tried to keep the whole house perfect. And Ethan. She looked toward the barn, where the oldest boy was finishing his work. Ethan forgot what it felt like to be 15. Nathan's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't see all of that. You were carrying too much. I failed them." Margaret gently shook her head. "You kept them alive." There was another quiet moment. Then she smiled. "My job was simply to help them live again." Nathan looked at her for a long time. "I've read your letters dozens of times while I was trapped in the mountains." "You received them." "Everyone." "The one describing each child." "I read it every night." He looked down at his rough hands. "I've been their father all these years." "I know." "And somehow you understood them in 3 weeks." Margaret smiled gently. "I had time to watch." Nathan laughed softly. "I've always been working." "And they noticed." "So did you." The following morning, Nathan surprised everyone. Instead of riding straight to the timber line after breakfast, he stayed home. He helped Samuel repair the chicken fence. He listened while Daniel explained a trap he wanted to build for rabbits. He asked Rachel about the book she had been reading. He carried Emma on his shoulders around the yard until she laughed so hard she nearly dropped her doll. Margaret watched quietly from the porch. Ethan stood beside her. He never used to do that. He didn't know he needed to. You told him. I reminded him. Ethan smiled. No. You changed him. Margaret gently shook her head. People only change when they're ready. By the middle of November, the cabin had become the happiest place in the valley. Neighbors who stopped by noticed it immediately. The children laughed more. Nathan smiled more. Even Ethan looked younger. One evening, after everyone had finished supper, Nathan cleared his throat. "I need to ask something." The children looked toward him. He stood and faced Margaret. "When I first wrote to Missouri," he smiled nervously, "I asked if you'd come west and become my wife." Margaret quietly listened. "I still hope that's possible." The room became completely silent. Nathan continued, "But if your answer is no," he looked toward the children, "I'll still spend the rest of my life thanking you for what you've already given this family." Margaret slowly stood. She walked across the room until she was standing beside him. "I came west looking for a husband." Nathan waited. "I found 8 children." The children smiled. "I found a mountain man who cared more about his family than himself." Nathan lowered his eyes. "And somewhere between baking biscuits, fixing fences, planting gardens, and watching these children smile again." She reached for his hand. "I found my home." Nathan gently held her hand. "So?" Margaret smiled. "My answer is yes." Jacob shouted before anyone else could speak. "I knew it." The room filled with laughter. Even Ethan laughed until tears filled his eyes. The wedding took place 2 weeks later beneath the large cottonwood tree beside the cabin. A traveling minister happened to be passing through the valley and happily performed the ceremony. Rachel carried a small bouquet of wildflowers. Daniel proudly stood beside his father. Grace helped decorate the porch. Samuel brushed the horses until they shined. Lily and Emma gathered autumn leaves to scatter along the path. Jacob refused to let go of Margaret's hand until the ceremony began. When the minister finally asked if anyone wished to say a few words, Ethan stepped forward. He looked first at his father, then at Margaret. "I thought she would leave the first morning." His voice became quiet. "I'm glad she didn't." There were tears in more than one pair of eyes. Years passed. The children grew taller. The garden grew larger. The cabin echoed with birthdays, harvest dinners, Christmas mornings, and ordinary evenings that slowly became precious memories. Jacob never stopped calling Margaret Mama. Soon the others did too. Not because anyone asked them. Because it felt true. One snowy evening many years later, Nathan sat beside the fireplace, while the grandchildren played on the same wooden floor where 8 frightened children had once stood silently watching a stranger walk through the front door. He looked at Margaret and smiled. "I was afraid 8 children would scare you away." Margaret reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "They were never just a number." Nathan smiled. "What were they?" Margaret looked around the warm cabin filled with laughter. "They were 8 hearts waiting for someone to stay." And on that autumn afternoon in 1878, when a mail-order bride arrived expecting to find one lonely mountain man, but instead found 8 waiting children and an empty porch, she could have turned around and gone back east. Instead, she unpacked her bags, rolled up her sleeves, baked biscuits for strangers, loved each child one at a time, and waited. In choosing to stay, Margaret Bennett did not simply become a mountain man's wife. She became the answer 8 children had been praying for long before she ever knocked on the cabin door.